And the first news story of the month is actually very much got my blood peaking. It comes from Sydney, Sydney, Australia, as the Americans would say, and it's actually news that footage shows a light rail project worker joking around and tossing human bones about while on the job. Um, are you surprised by this news at all, or I mean, because there were lots of very very righteous comments when this was shared on the Facebook page. People got very very angry.
They did, and understandably, because it's not what's supposed to happen for
No.
a number of reasons, which we'll come to in the course of this segment. But no, I wasn't surprised actually.
Hmm. Hmm.
You don't have to be around this game long to. First of all, you hear the stories about things that people do on site, and maybe people are a bit more aware nowadays, particularly with social media, that they can get caught out if they make a joke that seems brilliantly funny at the time, but might be taken or looked at outside of the work context, looked at
Hmm.
uh, without it might seem ill-judged. I mean,
Hmm.
the number of people who get caught out on social media these days, in all walks of society. There's no reason archaeologists shouldn't be the
There should be an
have similar
exception.
problems.
Hmm.
Should be an exception to that. But no, but also knowing the pressures that are under contract archaeologists working on development sites and so on, the fact that or too often still, they're seen as an inconvenience,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
something that delays the project.
Hmm.
I think no. To be honest, what surprises me is there aren't more of these incidents now, particularly now people carry mobile phones with video cameras.
Yeah, yeah, and well, I mean, in the past, I think I've told you either on camera or not about some of the horror stories I've seen, or been immediately witness to the aftermath of, including, for
Yeah,
example, contexts being destroyed actively by developers, um,
yeah,
and occasionally I've been witness to people being a little bit. Uh, uh, walking that fine line of being inappropriate with human remains. But in this
yeah.
instance, it's quite cut and dry actually, and to make it to just to have a straight headline in the Sydney Morning Herald, footage shows Sydney Light Railway project worker joking and tossing human bones, shows that really that this actually strikes at a sort of a human decency element. There is a legislative element that archaeologists are typically aware of, but also builders and human beings, by definition, normally have a slightly less callous response to human remains than this chap did. Basically, he was down in a pit in the road, came across some human remains, and just started tossing them out onto the road. And his colleagues are heard to be saying, we shouldn't have these on display. People are walking by. I think there was a comment about maybe it's essentially plastic bones, this kind of thing. It wasn't done in the proper way. But as much as we could harp on about this for 15 minutes and just say, "Oh, bad man," this is
Mm.
particularly harsh and sharply focused in the context of and a story that comes out of New Zealand. Now, obviously, New Zealand and Australia are different countries,
Absolutely.
they have similar archaeological thresholds and attitudes to certain
Mm.
periods of their own history. And in Australia, as in New Zealand, um, if this particular find was recovered, there are laws stipulating the recovery of bottles. Interestingly, so Victorian bottles, Georgian bottles, bottles from the era when lots of Antipodean towns and cities were getting going, actually are protected by law. You're not allowed to remove them out of their context. You certainly can't sell them on local market stores as we do here in the UK, because we're drowning in Victorian glassware in many respects. Um, but actually, this headline from New Zealand: Durham Lane dig turns up historic Worcestershire sauce bottles
Mm.
in Tauranga CBD. Uh, Really, just immediately highlights that you know there might be some weird, twisted um, educational priorities going on here in terms of. I mean, so in the case of this project in New Zealand, for the last couple of months, archaeologists have been monitoring work on the earthworks phase for a $6.1 million Tauranga City Council and New Zealand Transport Agency project. We have found a historic occupation site, including evidence for buildings and the rubbish of the occupants left behind, they said. And basically work comes to a halt for Worcestershire sauce bottles. And yet, and clearly they're left in context. These builders didn't remove this context. But in the case of the chap in Sydney, they're tossing around human bones. Now, I'm not sure. Is it clear whether these human bones are likely to be a native population or not?
Well, as I understand it, certainly from the material that's been openly published, the Sydney project came across either part of a colonial period cemetery or the periphery of a colonial period cemetery, where people who couldn't afford plots in the actual cemetery buried their dead just as close to it as they could get.
Right, right.
The dates that are being thrown around, well, put it this way, the site is actually a place called Chalmers Street in Sydney, and the cemetery is called the Devonshire Street Cemetery, which was consecrated in 1820. So we're dealing within the first sort of 50, 60 years of the life of Sydney as a town, and as a city. And these are almost certainly the bones of European settlers rather than first Australians.
Okay.
So,
at least there isn't that extra level of egregiousness going on there, in so much as the handling of those human remains are particularly sensitive.
They would be, in particular under Australian law, indeed. But but I don't think we should, everybody is equal in death and everyone's entitled to equal respect if their remains are turned up in a situation like this. So it was a pretty. It's the kind of black comedy that people do when they come across human remains. I don't know if you have any friends or relatives who work in the emergency services or in the health service. But I've grown up with people, for example, in our family working in the health service, and some of the things that they come back and joke about from home are jaw-dropping. But then it's a safety valve; it's a release.
Yes.
And it's a way of making really difficult situations emotionally bearable.
True,
and so I'm not, and don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to defend what the tradie, as he was described in one of the accounts I read from an Australian media outlet, what that person did. I mean, they were example. He said, anyone here he was talking to the audience around while he was doing this, and said, anyone here need a knee replacement? I've got 2 here. Words to that effect.
Well, 4, presumably.
Well,
including his own.
I'm not aware that he was actually filling in a skeleton contact sheet, recording sheet while he was doing it. So I don't know if you knew exactly how many he had anyway. But I think 2 lessons really. One, don't muck around like that when you think somebody might have an iPhone or Android phone with a video camera.
No, just don't muck around like that. In so much as actually, I mean, it's one thing joking about immediately finding human remains, but tossing them out onto the tarmac, even if the camera wasn't there, that's not good. That's not clever.
No, and I'm not trying to defend that, but I think it's another lesson in death by social media.
Yeah.
That's the point I'm making there. No, absolutely, it wasn't acceptable. There was clearly a problem. Now we know again from the Australian coverage that the Sydney Light Rail project has been subject to a lot of problems. But not to do with the archaeology, so it's controversial in the first place.
Well, it says in the article here that the discovery of the bones have set the light rail project. I keep on saying railway. The light rail project back, which was already more than a year behind schedule. This has been set it back by more time. Now, so you're talking about this idea of sort of basically, again, I suppose what we're hinting at here is training. The company involved, the guys, the the tradies boss company, Acciona, put out a statement that said Acciona requires all employees and subcontractors to comply with procedures for unexpected fines, to which workers on the project are trained and inducted. We continue to cooperate with the authorities in relation to the matter, and anyone involved in the project found to have engaged in any unacceptable behaviour will face disciplinary action. And
there's the point. I think the system appears to have broken down. It doesn't appear, for example, that there was an archaeologist there doing a watching brief, as might happen in the case in the UK if there were excavations going on. Now, again, we don't know why maybe given that Australia has a very similar development system to us in terms of people do watching, do desktop studies and watching briefs and test excavations and so on. It may be that the area that they were excavating came up as of being as low risk, and in fact, as happens, they got it wrong. There was no archaeologist there, and somebody thought they were helping the project move on by just dealing with this really quickly, and actually inappropriately they either hadn't had their training or they forgot their training, and it's just basically it's a cock up rather than conspiracy. But I just think in the end it highlights something that we all suspect and know goes on and various times. And in fact, archaeologists can sometimes be I'm always saying archaeologists aren't always the good guys. Archaeologists routinely machine through, for example, Victorian layers to get at the Roman and medieval because they're under pressure of time.
Because of course we need more Roman data, obviously.
But it happens. People prioritise sites, and some archaeology gets destroyed. And you can argue what's more inappropriate for a piece of our heritage than to be machined away by JCB. So there's lots of. We can. It's very easy to get holier than thou about this without actually defending what actually happened.
Yeah, and to be fair, I don't. As tempting as it would be to get overly holier than thou, I think what we've done here is we've highlighted that there was a problem, highlighted that maybe there's some skewed priorities in terms of Worcestershire sauce bottles and human remains, but also there is also this was wrapped up properly. The people will be facing disciplinary action, but also it's very clear that the remains were respectfully removed by heritage experts before further analysis.
From the outside of the trench where he'd thrown them, presumably.
Yeah. But even before they were confirmed to be human, they were carefully removed and then confirmed. So it looks like eventually, the safety net worked, but this is a very deeply unfortunate moment, and a moment that is understandably human, I suppose. You can understand where the as you say, the dark humour comes from, but okay. Well, moving on.
A lesson for everybody in that fact.
Yeah, well, exactly.
It's a lesson for everybody.
Yes, indeed. Yes, yeah.